Good morning. Welcome. We're so delighted to have all of you here in person and online through Zoom and watching through Wisconsin Eye for the 2022 Election Symposium being hosted by the Elections Research Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My name is Barry Burden. I'm the director of the Elections Research Center. And we are so pleased, especially for those of you who are here in person, to have some return to on-campus activities and some face-to-face interaction. We have a terrific lineup today, including perspectives from journalism and academia and polling and election analysis, all coming together to try to make sense of what happened in this strange election year and to put it in some perspective, even looking ahead to 2024. This was a really strange election, I think not one that most of us expected. It ended up producing essentially stalemate after a really intense election season, an unusual one in a number of ways. It was not a wave election, as we've become accustomed to in recent midterms like 2018 and 2014. In the end, the House of Representatives did flip from Democratic control to Republican control, but only because of a shift of 8 seats in the Republicans' direction, far below what was expected from the red wave. In the Senate, only 1 seat has shifted party control, so still very close to the 50-50 mix that we've been accustomed to, with 1 still waiting in Georgia with a runoff next week. In governor's elections, only 2 seats flipped, and they actually went to the Democrats on net, not to the Republicans. And in state legislatures that get so little attention, about 6,000 state legislative seats on the ballot this year. Typically, the party in the White House would lose hundreds of seats in a midterm election. It appears as though the Democrats lost 22 seats out of 6,000. So very much a repeat of the alignment of the parties that we've been accustomed to this year. Even in Wisconsin, the 2 marquee races on the ballot this year, the governor's race and the Senate race, both ended up re-electing the incumbent. Tony Evers for governor, Ron Johnson for US Senate. This was also the first time, apparently, in American history that not a single Senate incumbent around the country was defeated. Now, we have to wait on Georgia to make sure that that holds up, but assuming that Warnock pulls off the runoff, this will be the first time in the history of elected senators, so about 1 US century. It's not because voters were not interested. Voter turnout was high in 2022, the second highest turnout in a midterm election maybe in history, at least modern history, for midterm elections, as we know. There were a number of good signs for democracy, I think, this year. The orderly transition of power seems to be happening. The kinds of fears many of us had about disruptions that might occur at the polls, litigations, lawsuit recounts, objections to election results have mostly not come to pass. That's been a really delightful experience and surprise. It's been a good year for polling, as you'll hear later this afternoon. The accuracy of the pollsters, much better than it was 2 years ago in the 2020 presidential election, much better than in the 2016 presidential election. Both of those years saw pollsters overestimating how well Democrats would do, underestimating the vote for Trump in particular. That didn't happen this year. If anything, the pollsters were slightly erring in the opposite direction, giving Republicans a little higher expectations than actually panned out. It was also a good year for campaign consultants who benefit from high levels of campaign spending. Open Secrets estimates that there were about $17 billion spent on federal and state races this year. There were multiple Senate races around the country, including in Georgia, where over $250 million was spent just on those races. There was 1 ballot initiative in California which had over $600 million spent on one side of that issue. It did lose, so money doesn't get you everything, but lots of money being spent. It was also a year when candidate quality seemed to matter in a way that it had not in previous years. Mitch McConnell spoke about this as a problem for his party, having some candidates in Senate races who underperformed, maybe didn't take advantage of opportunities for Republican pickups in places like Pennsylvania and Arizona. And of course, the Dobbs decision back in late spring made abortion a prime consideration this year in a way that it had not been probably in any other election in American history. There's also, I think, a growing consensus coming out of the election that Donald Trump was a bit of a drag on Republicans. I've now seen a few analyses suggesting that candidates closely aligned with him underperformed relative to other Republicans. So it was not something party-wide, but on candidates attached to him in particular. And there's now some soul searching going on in the Republican Party about whether they'd like to see him at the helm again in 2024, what role he would play in the party. I think Kyle Kondik will probably talk later about where Republicans made gains, because they did, in fact, pick up votes relative to the last midterm election. But unfortunately for them, many of those gains were in states and districts where they were already doing well. And so not picking up seats or flipping places that may have been flippable. Democrats actually picked up state legislatures, some chambers this year. I think it's the first time in a midterm election in the United States that the president's party didn't lose a single chamber in any state legislature. So again, a really unusual year. All of this sets the stage for a presidential election, which already seems to be underway for 2024. We'll have a look at that today. So lots of terrific topics to dig through today and try to make sense of. So let me talk about some logistics, how today will operate. I first want to offer some thanks to Wisconsin Eye for collaborating with us on the coverage of today's event. This is streaming live and will also be archived on their website. I want to thank various individuals who have been involved to make this happen, in particular Levi Bankston, who works with the Elections Research Center, Jess Esplin, Veronica Judson, the staff here at the Discovery Building, and all of the faculty affiliates attached to the Elections Research Center who are helping to moderate sessions today. Presentations will proceed as the schedule indicates. If you're here in person, it's in the printed program. If you're online, it's on the website for the symposium. Each one of the presentations will be followed by a Q&A that will be moderated by another individual. You can submit questions at any time for the moderator to potentially pose to the presenter. If you're here in person, there are index cards on the table with pencils where you can write questions. We'll come around and pick those up throughout the day and feed those to our moderator as potential question material. If you are online watching on Zoom, you may submit questions through the Q&A function, not through the chat or by any other means, just through the Q&A function. The moderator will see those questions. If you're posting about the event on social media, say Twitter or other platforms, we do have a hashtag, which is ERC22. It's here on the cover slide. So feel free to use that and continue the conversation online while things are happening here in person. We will have a lunch break at 12:15. Again, if you're here in person, there are lots of good lunch options right across the street in Union South, where there are several places to grab a bite. There will also be some student presentations just outside the door here. If you're in person, there'll be several posters showcasing student projects. So I encourage you to stop by on your way in and out of lunch to say hello and see what they are up to. There will be a couple of breaks during the day. There'll be refreshments here in the room. So hang around, talk with your table mates and network. We're glad to have you. Okay, so let's turn to our first session for today. This will feature Kyle Kondik, who will get an introduction in a moment. Moderating the session will be my colleague, Mike Wagner. Mike is a faculty affiliate of the Elections Research Center. He's a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at UW-Madison. He's the co-author of numerous books and articles, including a recent study of the media ecosystem in Wisconsin called Battleground with several other colleagues here. Other books including Mediated Democracy, Political Behavior of the American Electorate, articles on political communication, the political information environment, and other studies attempting to understand mass political attitudes and behavior. He's also the founding director of the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal here at UW-Madison. So let's welcome Mike and Kyle in a moment to the stage.
Good morning, and thank you, Barry. Having just run a conference a week and a half ago and attended a different one earlier this week, I can tell you how hard it is to assemble panels that bring together a diverse array of leading scholars and practitioners to share the newest insights about what's happening to our country. And interacting those new insights with the oldest insights that we have about how elections influence our country. And whenever Barry and the Elections Research Center put on a conference like this, they do it for my money better than anybody. And so it's really a delight to be a part of this. Congrats to Barry and to Levi and the whole team for putting another great event together. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kyle Kondik. He is a frequently cited analyst of American campaigns and elections. He's the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, which is one of those websites that you constantly hit refresh on during the election season to see their latest updates about House races and Senate races and governor's races and the generic ballot and deep nonpartisan analyses of what it is that's happening in the electoral environment in the United States. It is a go-to place for excellent elections analysis. He is also the author of The Long Red Thread, A History of Recent House Elections, and also of The Bellwether, an analysis of presidential voting history of his home state of Ohio, which I am told is an important state in presidential politics in the United States. In 2022, Kyle became a member of the CBS News Election Decision Desk team. So he also plays a critical role in helping us understand who wins and how we know that those folks have won and how we communicate those facts to major audiences who are interested in election results. Perhaps most importantly, his spouse is a Badger alum, so we know that he is wise when he makes critical decisions about the rest of his life. So we're going to hear a great presentation from Kyle. I'll ask him a few questions, and then we'll start looking for the questions you all ask online through that Q&A function or on your note cards at your tables, and we'll have a robust conversation with Kyle Kondik.
Thanks, Mike. It's really great to be here. As he mentioned, my wife is a Badger, and I'm the rare Ohio person who's otherwise an Ohio booster, but I just hate Ohio State football. So I've basically adopted the Badgers as my Big Ten team. So I went to Ohio University. My dad went to Ohio University too in Southeast Ohio, and for all his life, he said, "Oh yeah, I went to OU," and they'd say, "Oh, go Buckeyes!" Like they didn't really even know, what Ohio University was. That it was different. There's actually, was there before Ohio State and all that. So I've an axe to grind about Ohio State, which is very popular when I talk at other Big Ten schools. I did something in Indiana, and they were all happy to hear that too. So everybody hates Ohio State. But anyway, not the institutional football thing, but anyway, really great to be here. So I want to, I guess I need to bring this up. It's my, I guess it's on the, should be on the desktop here. Sorry about this. It's the one that says Kondik, my last name. Here we go. Okay. And all right. So when I've been given presentations throughout the fall in advance of the election, I was using this picture of Vince Lombardi talking about, you've probably seen the NFL Films clip, what the hell is going on out here? Meaning that, it's a pretty confusing election. And I figured I would just keep it, one, because I'm in Wisconsin, and two, because I still think it applies. I mean, it's kind of a strange result, as Professor Burton was talking about, with a lot of sort of mixed results across the country. And, one of the things I've been thinking about is this book I read earlier this year by a guy named Jeff Garten, who you probably have heard of his wife, Ina Garten, who's the Barefoot Contessa. So when Jeffrey shows up for chicken after being at Yale all week or whatever on the show, that's who he is. And, he's working on a book or whatever, but the guy's a very accomplished businessman and academic himself. And he wrote this book recently called 3 Days at Camp David, about President Nixon's decision in 1971 to take the U.S. off the gold standard, which is a very important development in U.S. economic history and also economic history of the world, really. But there was this quote in the book that sort of stuck with me that I just thought was really interesting. I'm going to read it to you. Quote, Nixon would be obsessed with avoiding recession and the higher unemployment it would bring. He was convinced that jobs equaled votes and that no one ever lost an election because of rising prices. Biographer Richard Reeves wrote that Nixon repeatedly interrupted cabinet meetings to go over the history of Republican defeats when the economy was in slow growth or decline. Quote, when you start talking about inflation in the abstract, it's hard for people to understand. Nixon told the cabinet committee the month after he took office, but when unemployment goes up 0.5%, that's dynamite. I was thinking about this in the sense that all the way from the late 60s, all the way through the early 80s, the United States had this persistent inflation problem. And finally, when Paul Volcker was the Fed chair, they sort of stamped that out of the system pretty aggressively by raising interest rates very high in the late 70s and the early 80s. But throughout that time period, you don't necessarily see there being these sort of huge wave elections based on inflation 1974 was a wave, but that was sort of more about Watergate and other economic problems. That was against, that was the first election after Nixon had resigned. Ford was president. Democrats did really well in that election. But when I was sort of thinking about potential parallels to this election and both in the lead up to the election and afterward, 1978, 1982 kind of came up. And I wouldn't say that those are particularly famous midterms, but they were times where inflation was high, and yet the president's party did not actually do that poorly in both those elections. Additionally, the presidents at the time too, Jimmy Carter in 78 and Ronald Reagan in 82, they were not particularly popular. Both their approval ratings were under 50% at the time of that election. This picture here of Ronald Reagan and then NFL star, football star Jack Kemp, who went on to become a leading conservative in Congress. And there were a number of things that sort of ended up kind of upsetting the apple cart and sort of preventing waves from happening in 1978 and 1982. One of them was that the inflation issue either wasn't actually all that electorally important, or the opposition or the president's party was able to sort of co-opt it and not allow the opposition party to use it against them. One of the ways this happened, that's why I have a picture of Jack Kemp up here, is that one of the big things in the late 70s was that Jack Kemp and Delaware Senator William Roth had proposed this big tax cut called Kemp-Roth. If you read about politics back in that period, you see that mentioned a lot. And the Democrats were actually able to attack the tax cuts as being potentially inflationary, essentially stealing the issue of inflation from the Republicans in that election. In 1982, again, the inflation problem is maybe not quite as bad, but if you've noticed in the reporting about inflation in this year and last year, a lot of the historical highs are, the worst they've been since 1981 or 1982. So we know that, the inflation problem was still significant back then. But for a variety of reasons, the Democrats made big gains in the House, or okay gains in the House that year. But they ended up not making really any gains in the Senate at all. And part of it, historians will cite at the time, was that the Republicans were able to essentially kind of blame the Democrats for some of the economic problems, given their own control of at least the House back then. Also, there were some campaign effects that it seemed like were pretty positive for Republicans in that election, including the fact that Republican fundraising and candidate recruitment was better, which sort of reminded me too of what happened in this election, and that the Democrats had a lot of strong incumbents in a lot of places. Republicans had a lot of weak challengers in a number of places, and a lot of Democratic candidates had fundraising advantages. One other parallel between the 22 election and these historical elections, 78 and 82, is that the Senate map, there's the composition of the seats up every 2 years, and the Senate is really important. And sometimes, one side will be advantaged just by the roster of seats that's up. So in 1978, the Republicans made some modest gains in the Senate, but they already came into that election holding a slim majority of the seats being contested. And so historically speaking, the more you hold, the harder it is to actually gain in an election. And in 1982, the Democrats had a long string of good Senate elections on that particular Senate map. And so it's hard for them to gain ground in the Senate that time as well. In this election, you had 35 seats being contested in the Senate. The Republicans already held 21 of the 35 of them being contested. And so just that dynamic alone was always going to be a challenge for the Republicans to overcome. And for a variety of other reasons, they ended up essentially striking out in the Senate. Again, we still have the Georgia race to come here. So I've found that this election, I've sort of found it hard to sort of contextualize, particularly because we did sort of get accustomed to these wave elections that we've had. Certainly each of the last four prior to this one, you would classify in that category. But then if you go back a little bit further and you look at some of the midterms, certainly 2002 and 1998, which were actually years where the president's party actually gained a little bit of ground in the House. And then some of these other years in the 70s and 80s, you find that there actually aren't that many, big waves. And so maybe this election we have is sort of a little more comparable to some of those ones we've had in the more distant past. Let me talk a little bit about, just sort of the overall environment after the election here. So one of the sort of striking things is just that, presidential partisanship is being reflected kind of more and more in the down ballot, Senate and House results. And so assuming Raphael Warnock wins in Georgia on Tuesday, which I think he's favored, I wouldn't say it's, I wouldn't bet a ton of money on it, but I think the overall indicators are pretty positive for Warnock. But if Warnock wins, we're only going to have 5 split Senate delegations across the whole country. And so only 5 of the 100 senators will represent states that their party did not win in the most recent presidential election. Of course, Ron Johnson here in Wisconsin is one of them, although he won a very narrow victory last week. And of course, Wisconsin is a very competitive state. You've got Susan Collins in Maine, who won in 2020. And then you've got 3 Democrats in Trump-won seats, John Tester in Montana, Sherrod Brown of Ohio, and Joe Manchin of West Virginia. They're all on the ballot in 2024. And that sort of tells you something about the difficulties that Democrats have on the upcoming Senate map. Speaking of, this is the Senate map coming up for 2024. And so the Democrats are defending 23 of the 33 seats being contested. There's probably going to be a 34th. Ben Sasse of Nebraska is likely to become the president of the University of Florida. So that'll be a special election in Nebraska, but I don't think Democrats have much of a shot at either Senate seat in Nebraska. And just look at, the seats the Republicans currently are defending on this map. It's a lot of kind of dark red states that maybe used to be competitive, like Missouri and Indiana, that really aren't anymore. Really the only potential offensive targets you'd see for the Democrats on this map is maybe Texas and maybe Florida. But I'd classify both those states as sort of Republican leaning at this point. Meanwhile, a lot of the most vulnerable Democratic senators are on the ballot. I mentioned Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. You've also got Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona, who may have some primary problems of her own. And then you've got competitive presidential battleground states with incumbent Democratic senators like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada. So this is actually why this Georgia race coming up, I think about it more as like the first Senate race of 2024 as opposed to the last one of 2022, because the Democrats really need to find themselves an extra seat if they have any shot of holding on, in this very challenging map coming up in 2024. There are some actual, governing consequences to being at 51 instead of 50. Specifically, Democrats would have majorities on committees, if that indeed is the case, which would make it easier for them to more quickly confirm judicial nominees. And that's kind of what the Senate is. The Senate's a lot of things, but one of its main duties right now is just pumping out as many judicial nominations as possible for the president's party, if the president's party does in fact control the Senate. But so there are logistical advantages there, but it's really about the numbers. And you could sort of imagine a world where Democrats could sort of hold down their losses enough in 2024 if they can at least afford to lose 1 seat 2 years from now, but only being being at 50-50 still, and with one seat just flipping the Senate, that becomes a little bit harder for them. The other thing that how I would contextualize the 2022 Senate results, and it has to do with the 24 map as well, is I don't know if we have any Star Trek fans out there, but Star Trek 3, so bear with me here. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's not, Star Trek 2 is generally regarded as more of the sort of masterpiece of the 1980s Star Trek movies. But anyway, I've got a point here. Just bear with me. So at the end of the movie, sorry, spoiler alert, the first Enterprise is blown up by self-destruct, and Captain Kirk and Dr. McCoy beam down, and Captain Kirk is watching the burning Enterprise on the horizon and says, "Bones, what have I done?" And Dr. McCoy says, "You did what you always do. You turned death into a fighting chance to live." And that's what the Democrats did in this 2022 Senate election. Because had the Republicans actually, maxed out and gotten like 53, 54 Senate seats, if they had, flipped Arizona, if they had held Pennsylvania, if they won Georgia, which of course they still can, if they had done that, with this map upcoming, it'd be more of a question of, can Republicans get to like 60 Senate seats? And then do they have like hammerlock on the Senate for several cycles in a row? Instead, not only did the Democrats hang on, but again, they gave themselves a fighting chance to live potentially in 2024, particularly if they hold Georgia. So that's one way to frame it. One of the things that, and I'll talk about this in the House a little bit too, is that, in American politics, you can argue that the Republicans have a little bit of a structural advantage in the Electoral College, in the Senate, and also in the House, in that sort of the median electoral vote, the median Senate seat, and the median House seat lean a little bit to the right of the nation as a whole. And then it's just a question of, can Republicans actually, turn those advantages on paper into advantages in practice? And they certainly were able to do that, like in the 2016 presidential election, when they won fewer popular votes, but were able to win the Electoral College. And there are some Democrats, some pretty famous people. There's a guy named David Shor who's become this pretty prominent, data analyst on the Democratic side. And he was ringing the alarm bell in 2021 and earlier this year that, like, hey, if Democrats have a bad Senate election this year, we might be wiped out in the Senate for years to come here. And so that's again, it's not just keeping the Senate in 2022 for the Democrats. It's also sort of holding off this sort of structural disadvantage that has threatened to give Republicans this sort of big and sort of long-lasting majority in the Senate, which they've sort of failed to capitalize on in this past election. In the House was interesting in that, you went from it looks like the House popular vote, once you adjust for uncontested seats, it's going to be a Republican advantage of something like 2 to 3 points. That's a roughly 5 to 6 point swing from 2020, where the Democrats won the adjusted House popular vote by about 3 points. And so, it's a significant swing, and yet it looks like Republicans are only going to net like 8 or 9 seats. And part of what happened is that the Republican gains were sort of inefficient across the country. And so this map shows sort of the difference between the 2020 House vote in the states versus the 2022 House vote. And you can see that there were like big red waves in like New York and Florida, for instance, and in some other states across the country. But in some states, the Democrats actually did a little bit better than they had done in 2020. And I would particularly focus on an area of the country that I still think is electorally the most important, which is sort of the Midwest. And Pennsylvania is not technically part of the Midwest, but if you sort of include it in that group. And if you go from eastern Pennsylvania and the Lehigh Valley, essentially all the way to the Mississippi River in western Illinois, the Republicans basically didn't win any of the truly competitive House races in that whole region. And that's part of the reason why their majority is going to be so small, is that they just did not capitalize on the opportunities that they had. One factor in that was that you had some Republican gerrymanders in some of those states in the recent past. Some states have gone away with those. Michigan went to a nonpartisan system. The Pennsylvania State Supreme Court intervened against Republican gerrymander, not just in this most recent round of redistricting, but also a couple of cycles ago. Ohio had a process that was still partisan Republican, but there were some constraints imposed against Republicans in that state. Illinois was a Democratic gerrymander. Wisconsin does retain effectively a Republican gerrymander at the congressional and state legislative level. But I think it's really interesting that, the Midwest, again, if you think about the long scope of American history, like this is kind of where elections are won and lost in American political life. And you go back to 2016, Donald Trump won the presidential election in large part because he flipped a lot of the Midwestern states, including the so-called blue wall of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin by small margins. And the real promise of the sort of Trump realigned Republican Party was that, particularly in states where you had a higher percentage of white voters who don't have a 4-year degree, which is a group that has been sort of zooming toward Republicans in recent years, that despite losses in some other states for Republicans in states that are more diverse and have higher levels of 4-year college attainment, like Virginia, for instance, or places like Georgia and Arizona, et cetera. The thought, I think, for Republicans, or the hope, was that this realignment in the Midwest, that had helped Trump and Republicans in recent years, would sort of continue. And I don't think there were that many signs that it continued in 2022. Now, that doesn't have any predictive value for 2024 necessarily, but as Republicans think about who they're going to nominate for president and what sort of path they should take, they can't really point to a lot of positive results in this very important electoral region. Despite a lot of weak candidates, frankly, in races across the country and some missed opportunities, I think it is kind of striking that There are 18 Republicans who won Biden-won districts. That's the table on the right there, and only 5 Democrats who won Trump-won seats. And so in a 222 to 213 Republican House, that difference in these sort of crossover seats is the difference between holding the majority and not holding the majority. And so Republicans were able to win on some unfavorable turf. And this is often what happens in a midterm environment, is that the opposition party cuts a little bit more deeply into seats that lean a little bit more toward the presidential party. You could see that the number of crossover seats for the opposition party, it sort of spikes in the midterm years. So like 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018, 2022, you can see that dynamic in all those years. But just like with the Senate, the nationalization of American elections is also present in the House. You have fewer and fewer, generally speaking, of these crossover seats. The Democrats used to hold a lot of kind of moderate to conservative leaning turf, particularly in the South, places that voted Republican for president. A lot of those districts have been wiped out over time. But the presidential voting has become much more predictive of the down ballot House voting over time, particularly in presidential years, but you see the dynamic in the midterm years as well. Just a brief note on redistricting. So the map on the left shows the changes in the total number of House seats that the various states have held from 1960 to 2020. Notice that there are, the Northeast and the Midwest have lost a lot of ground as population growth has just been slower in that region. The Sun Belt has gained tremendously over that time. And so you've got, Florida, Texas, California gaining a ton of seats. This general trend continued in the 2020 reapportionment. Although the one little wild card is that California actually lost a seat. It's the first time it had ever lost a seat, although California continues to have the biggest House delegation. And then the table on the right shows the kind of puts all the House seats into various buckets based on how Biden did in those districts. And if you think of the most competitive House seats as being the ones that are sort of bunched more closely to how Biden did, so I define that as places where Biden got between 47 and 55% of the vote. The number of seats in that category fell from 84 to 75 in the most recent redistricting. So a few less truly competitive seats, but if you consider there to be basically 75 competitive seats in the House, so roughly speaking, and it changes from year to year, that's still enough to flip the House from year to year, whatever the circumstances may be. If you go outside that band of what I define as R+4 to D+4, the Republicans only won one seat where Biden won more than 55% of the vote, and the Democrats only won 2 seats where Biden got less than 47%. So the real action in the House in 2022 and in many previous elections is really in that band of districts that most closely reflects the national voting. Let me take a little brief history tour here through the House. So just to show you how the composition of the chamber has changed. So of course, the Democrats had effectively this permanent majority in the House from the time of the Great Depression through the Republican Revolution of 1994. The Democrats held the House for 60 of 64 years in that time period. Now, those House majorities were a lot different than a Democratic House majority today. There were a lot more kind of conservative Southerners. It was the Democratic Party was this coalition both of sort of liberal Northeasterners and also, frankly, some not very liberal, Northern and Midwestern members, and then also conservative Southerners. So Democratic majorities today will be much smaller, but also be more consistently liberal. And I think you could say the same thing about the ideology of the Republican House caucus. But notice that in the 60s is pretty representative of what the House looked like at that time. Democrats control a huge chunk of the seats in the South. They have small advantages on the West Coast and the Northeast, and the Republicans do kind of well in the middle of the country. By 1994, which is the year of the Republican Revolution, you could see that the kind of regional mix in the House is sort of is not particularly consistent. The Republicans finally get over the hump in the South and win a small majority in that region. You could also see there aren't particularly clear advantages for either party in the other regions outside the interior West, which is the region that has the fewest percentage of House seats anyway. By 2020. You could see the South getting much more Republican. Republicans retain these sort of smaller advantages in the middle of the country, and then the Northeast and the West Coast are extremely Democratic. And then 2022 is on the right there. And, I mentioned the Midwest. One thing that was striking is that the Republicans won the House majority back, but they actually did a little bit worse in the Midwest than they had done in 2020, which historically speaking is kind of odd that the Midwest would sort of move a little bit of a different direction than the way the sort of rest of the country more broadly had. The Republicans did make up a little bit of ground on the West Coast and a little bit of ground in the Northeast. But a lot of what allows Republicans to win the House majority is that they're now the dominant party in the South. They're up to over 70% of the seats in the South. And notice that the South also makes up by far the biggest share of these 5 regions of the total House seats. They're up to 36% of all the seats. And so, this is the sort of general dynamic, and it reflects how the Electoral College looks. Of course, Democrats do really well in the Northeast and the West Coast. Republicans do really, really well in the South, and then kind of the middle of the country has a number of swing states. Just briefly on governor's elections, the Democrats also had a good election for governors. They ended up netting 2 seats. Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak, a Democrat, was the only incumbent governor who lost. So Professor Burden mentioned that it looks like no incumbent senators lost, except for maybe Warnock in Georgia. And there was only one incumbent governor who lost 2. So it was very stable in terms of the Senate and gubernatorial elections. But so the Democrats lost Nevada, but they picked up open seats in Arizona, Massachusetts, and Maryland. The net effect had sort of led to a little bit more of a kind of a nationalized result in the governor's election, and that you had 2 really blue states that had Republican governors electing Democratic governors. But you could still see that the gubernatorial map does look a little bit different than like what the Electoral College would look like, in that, Virginia has a Republican governor elected last year. Nevada now has a Republican governor. You still have Republican governors in Vermont and New Hampshire, even though Vermont is a very blue state at the federal level. New Hampshire is kind of a light blue state. And then you've also got Democratic governors in like Kansas, Kentucky, and Louisiana. Of course, and Kansas just reelected its Democratic governor in 2022. So there's a little bit more of an opportunity to kind of break away from the sort of federalized or sort of nationalized voting pattern in these governor's races. But again, the basic pattern is still pretty familiar to what the 2020 presidential results were. Biden's approval, that's one of the striking things about the election, was that Biden's approval was bad throughout the whole election. It got a little bit better in the late summer and fall, but he was still kind of in the low 40s. But that did not end up being fatal to Democratic chances. And again, he is a rare kind of unpopular president to preside over a pretty good midterm for his party. But that said, you're an incumbent president running for re-election and your approval's in the low 40s, that would seem to be a danger zone. Now, the question is, as with many elections, is like, will the election in 24 be more of a referendum on Biden, or will it be more of a choice between Democrats and Republicans? If it's a referendum, it's bad for Biden. If it's more of a choice, gives Biden a better chance. And this was another question we were sort of pondering over the course of the election, was, would this election be more of a referendum or of a choice? And at least in a lot of key places, ended up being more of a choice, and a lot of key swing voters ended up going with the Democrats. I think that, it doesn't seem like Biden is going to have a credible challenger within his own party. You think about some of the maybe potential kind of rising stars within the Democratic Party. Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor of California, Gretchen Whitmer, Democratic governor of Michigan, probably some other folks. They don't seem particularly likely to challenge a sitting president. Now, if Biden were to decide to retire, then, all bets are off. You'd probably have a very crowded presidential primary field. But for the time being, I think if Biden wants to run again, I don't really see much of a challenge emerging. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is running again on the Republican side. It seems like he will have credible opposition, although he doesn't have announced opposition yet. Ron DeSantis, Florida governor, has sort of emerged, I think, as sort of the chic kind of anti-Trump pick. And one thing that pops out from some polling, and in fact, I know Professor Franklin, who runs the Marquette poll, will be speaking later today, and he found this in his own national poll that they released earlier this week, is that you're starting to see this sort of college versus non-college dynamic on the Republican side. And it made me think about this term coined by Ron Brownstein, who's a longtime political analyst, CNN and LA Times and a bunch of other places. And he would use it to describe the Democratic Party, but you can also see it on the Republican side, I think, in this election. And that is the so-called wine track versus beer track. And it's sort of like a, kind of blue collar versus white collar dynamic that sometimes emerges in these primaries. A classic example is probably the 2008 Democratic presidential primary, in which Hillary Clinton actually ended up being the beer track candidate and did well with, particularly with like white working class voters. Obama did better with sort of affluent suburbanites, but he also had this sort of, multiracial coalition by the time he became established as a candidate. And so the wine track kind of equates on a Republican primary to sort of the more party elites and also the voters who may have a 4-year college degree, and beer track maybe equates more to voters who don't have a 4-year college degree. And again, you could see this in the polls and that, and again, in Professor Franklin's poll and in others, that DeSantis has better favorability amongst college educated Republicans. And he also does better in the horse race amongst college-educated Republicans than, and Trump does a little bit better amongst the non-college crowd. And so I think this dynamic will be interesting to watch if, in fact, it is DeSantis versus Trump. You, of course, could see many other candidates decide to get in. I will say that if you look at the demographics of the electorate, unless a DeSantis or another Trump candidate can not only do well amongst the college-educated cohort, but also peel off some of the non-college cohort, which is just a bigger percentage of voters, that person is going to need to take some of those people from Trump, because if they don't, I think it's going to be hard for Trump to actually be defeated in a primary environment. But again, there's a lot of time to figure that out. The primary calendar is still being composed. You may have seen that the Democrats are reconfiguring their primary calendar. It looks like Michigan is going to have a more prominent role in that process. Coming up here in Iowa is going to be kicked to the curb potentially. But so there's a lot of time for that all to shake out. So that concludes the formal remarks here. If you're interested in this stuff, please sign up for our Crystal Ball newsletter. We come out once or twice a week. We'll have something to say about Georgia on Monday, I think. centerforpolitics.org/crystal ball, or you could just search crystal ball on Google. You'll get some ads to buy an actual crystal ball. Just get past that, and then we're below those pictures. Otherwise, thanks for having me again, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Button to turn on your microphone. Thank you, Barry. Thank you very much for that very engaging and jam-packed with great information presentation. I'll have a couple of questions to get us started. And again, if folks have questions on note cards, they can see Levi, who's walking around over there, or folks online can and use the Q&A function on Zoom, and I can see those questions too. So I want to ask a couple of questions before we turn it to the audience. So you kicked off talking about inflation and how that maybe wasn't an issue that mattered in the way that the media narrative and many candidates hoped that it might. Another issue that mattered that may have mattered in the election, of course, was the abortion issue on the heels of the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade. And I'm curious about what evidence have you seen with your analyses at Sabato's Crystal Ball that issue played a role in Democrats holding in so many of the places that they were able to hold?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that there was some thought that Democrats might hold up a little bit better in battlegrounds than in some of the bluer states, because abortion rights were seen as under attack there. I also think, look, obviously the Dobbs decision, it's one of the most consequential, Supreme Court decisions of our lifetime. I think it changed I didn't, this is a point I was making before the election. I didn't make it in my formal remarks, but I'll make it here. It kind of upset the apple cart of what you usually see in the election, in that part of the reason why the president's party probably struggles historically in the midterm environment is that basically, the president's party is seen as being in charge, particularly if they have full control of government. And maybe they do things that end up being unpopular, like the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, I think is a great example of that. And so there's like the public will use the midterm to sort of put a check on the White House, which in fact did happen in this election. The House is now Republican. I mean, that's a classic thing you see in the midterm is that chambers flip. The House has flipped 12 times since 1900. 10 of those have happened in midterms now. So the midterm, serves that purpose, and it did in this election. However, the Dobbs decision is so interesting in terms of like changing the usual kind of accountability metric or whatever of the midterm, and that it was arguably the biggest policy change that happened in the past 2 years. And it wasn't something that the Democrats, the ruling party, did. It was something the opposition party did through their control of the Supreme Court. So that probably, I think, changed the who is perceived to be in charge, who gets punished, who gets rewarded in the midterm. And I also think that, I think probably January 6th maybe mattered more than it certainly seemed like polls would indicate. But I also think that the Dobbs decision was such a great, for lack of a better term, kind of like you're a journalism professor, I have a journalism degree. One of the terms we sometimes use is news peg, just something you can use to sort of explain the sort of larger phenomenon or something that's in the news that's interesting to people. I think abortion was a great news peg for Democratic arguments about Republican extremism. And so abortion is there, and a lot of the Republican candidates had pretty far-right extreme views on abortion. And oh, by the way, they also don't believe in the results of the 2020 election, or they're extreme on this or extreme on that. And maybe it just made the argument easier to make, not just about abortion, but about other things as well. Because it is interesting that, you had Republican governors in some, Republican-leaning but competitive states who signed or oversaw restrictions on abortions, and many of them weren't punished at all. I mean, Mike DeWine in Ohio did great. Greg Abbott in Texas did great. Ron DeSantis in Florida did great. Brian Kemp in Georgia did great. So it wasn't all about abortion. But then in Michigan, you have basically a blue wave, and there's this abortion issue on the ballot. Frankly, I think that Governor Evers was probably helped by the thought that he's sort of the only thing standing in the way of Wisconsin, being dominated by Republicans. And of course, there's a battle about abortion law in Wisconsin that's going on. And so, it sort of hit unevenly in different places. But again, where it seemed to have the most impact was in the places that were most competitive.
So you talked a lot about structure and how some of these things have changed regionally over time. And that's a very valuable thing, because as many people tend to think about elections, structure is not the first thing that comes to mind, even though it's incredibly important with respect to how things turn out. But one thing that's often on people's minds when they think about elections is money in politics. And so I'll ask a money in politics question, but I'll narrowly focus it on Wisconsin. It's something a couple of folks have asked about on the note cards. So in Wisconsin, in the House district, the DCCC pulled out of giving money to Brad Pfaff's race against Congressman-elect Van Orden, who ended up winning by about 4 points, closer than maybe folks thought it might be. Sure. And with Pfaff losing, and with Mandela Barnes getting very close, but not close enough to defeat incumbent Senator Ron Johnson, the spending in these places make a difference when things are this close, or is the focus on money misplaced?
I think it certainly could. I mean, I think that Wisconsin was one place where you did have an actual Republican incumbent running. And Ron Johnson, he has his fans, he has his detractors, his numbers are not that great. But he was, he didn't have a primary. It was, Republicans were at this big, what I'll call hard money spending despair or disadvantage in so many places. And what I mean by hard money is the money actually raised by the candidates. And that's important because yes, there's lots of outside money that comes in these races, like Senate Leadership Fund, which is, the outside group connected to Mitch McConnell. There are Democratic equivalents to that too. They end up coming in and spending tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on these races. But the candidates themselves get more bang for their buck in terms of booking the advertisements. Based on federal law, this goes back to I think the late 60s, early 70s. The candidates are given better rates on television than the outside groups are. And so, the fact that I don't know exactly where it all ended up, but Johnson did have a sort of an early advantage, and that may have been helpful in what ended up being a 1-point race. And, it's also interesting to note that Senate Leadership Fund, they ended up spending a lot of money in North Carolina. They spent a lot of money in Wisconsin. They spent a lot of money in Ohio. Could that money have been used, differently or better elsewhere? They ended up winning North Carolina, I think, by 4, Ohio by 6. Would more money, because they really didn't spend in like Arizona and New Hampshire down the stretch, although those races ended up being not that close. So, when you've got a race that's like a 1 or 2 point race, I think maybe you think, oh, maybe extra resources would have helped. But when it ends up being like 5 or 6 points, how much of that, it's hard to quantify the actual effect there. But, it also seems like in the places where the campaign was like most engaged, Democrats ended up doing pretty well there. I also think there's an interesting what if about the Wisconsin Senate race. And that is, would someone other than Barnes have won? Because Barnes did have, Frank, I think a lot of the national Democrats ended up not being particularly confident in the campaign that he ran. Republicans were hammering him on some of the things he'd said about the crime issue and criminal justice reform. It's, I think the Republicans kind of struck out a lot of that messaging in a number of places. But, given that Johnson was unpopular, given that Evers ended up winning, I think, what I think it was like 3.5 or 3.7 points, like it's pretty good for Wisconsin in a, in a midterm year like this. We focus so much on the Republicans and their candidate quality issues undermining them in some of these races. If somebody else had gotten the nomination, would that person be senator-elect from Wisconsin now? I don't know the answer to that. But when it's a 1-point race, I mean, on one hand, you could say Barnes sort of did better. I think he did better than I thought he would do. But at the same time, could somebody else have gotten over the finish line? It's an unanswerable question.
Yeah, it's hard to answer. And he did better than Russ Feingold did, who ran twice against him. And is the kind of candidate that people who don't like Barnes say, well, if only they'd been more like, some of the other folks who were in the primary, which Feingold was more like, but lost twice to Johnson.
One thing I also thought was interesting is that, that Wisconsin 3rd district that Derek Van Orden won, it's kind of a classic example, the sort of place that's sort of trending away from Democrats in recent years. And there are actually a number of districts like that were gerrymandered by Republicans to elect Democrats a decade ago and are now Republican leaning districts because the Democratic Party has declined so much in kind of white rural small town districts. Like Tim Ryan's old district in Ohio is a great example of that too. It was reconfigured and actually a Democrat held it. It's now more of a Akron based seat, but Tony Evers actually carried Wisconsin 3. I think it was only by a little less than a point, but Johnson won it, I think, by 5 points. So that, and you saw that sort of disparity across the state, but I think it seemed particularly pronounced in sort of northern and western Wisconsin. I'm sure Professor Franklin will talk about this more, but I know he's got some maps that sort of illustrate that trend. And so, you asked about the 3rd congressional district race specifically, would more Democratic spending have helped there? In a 4-point race, again, I don't know the answer to that. That also does illustrate one of the things that Democrats were talking about before the election as a big reason why they were, obviously worried about losing the House majority. And that is they just had a lot of open seats to defend. Like, what if Ron Kind had run for re-election? Could he have won? I think he definitely could have, given what we know about what ended up happening. Now, I understand why he retired, because he probably thought that it was going to be a tough year, which it was, and he almost lost in 2020. But you had a number of races that were rematches across the country with Democratic incumbents who barely won in 2020, and then they ended up doing better in 2022 in substantially similar districts as Wisconsin 3 was to the old version of it. And if there had been more Democrats who had run for re-election in the House, maybe they still would have held the majority. So that's a kind of a, that's not a, think about the political environment. That's like, it speaks to candidate quality and open seats and that sort of thing. And that's decisions that candidates make and campaigns make.
So one more specific race, election rate question before moving to some more general trends. Lots of great questions from the in-person and online audiences. This one's about the North Carolina Senate race. So North Carolina Senate race, quite close and competitive. Do you have ideas why we didn't hear as much about that race, had less national attention and the like, which might have influence an outcome in some kind of way, less focus, maybe that influenced fundraising, maybe it influenced interest of voters who might have paid more attention had they heard more about it?
North Carolina is a state that's kind of been one of those places where Democrats can come close, but they just haven't won recently. You know, Obama did carry the state in 2008. Kay Hagan won the Senate race in 2008, but the Democrats have not carried this, lost the state for president narrowly in 12, 16, and 20. They've also lost some high profile Senate races in that state in recent years. And so I think that, you know, Republicans did end up spending a ton of money there. And, you know, Sherry Beasley is a very credible Democratic candidate in that state, but it just never seemed like it was actually like a real toss up to me. And, you know, one interesting, just sort of general dynamic was that Black turnout was not particularly great in this election across the country. Of course, Black turnout is so important for Democrats because Black voters break so heavily toward Democrats. And you may have seen, I think Nate Cohn in the New York Times a couple of days ago wrote about Black turnout problems in, you know, like Milwaukee and Cleveland and Detroit and other kind of big, in Philadelphia, you know, big vote centers in the North. But you can also see it in like rural Black turnout in North Carolina. So it's interesting that you have you went from having Cal Cunningham in 2020 as the Democratic Senate nominee in North Carolina, who I guess became best known for having an affair during the campaign. But he was sort of your standard, like kind of like a sort of, you know, Democrats have been sort of looking for the next John Edwards in the South for the last 15, 20 years, even though John Edwards also had all sorts of problems. But he was sort of I think an interesting, effective candidate as sort of his heyday. But they were sort of looking for this sort of like milquetoast, kind of moderate, handsome Southern white guy, you know, for lack of a better way of putting it. And you know, so then this time the Democrats went with Sherry Beasley, who's a Black candidate, was the former Supreme Court Chief Justice in North Carolina. And despite the change in the bio of the two candidates, Beasley ran behind Cunningham in a lot of the rural Black areas in Eastern North Carolina, and Beasley did better than Cal Cunningham did in some of suburban Charlotte. So it just goes to show that even though the candidate mix was totally different, these sort of broader trends were still taking hold. And, you know, North Carolina is so interesting in that it, you know, I had thought for a while, so, you know, I've been at the University of Virginia Center for Politics for a long time now. You know, Virginia, despite electing a Republican governor last year, has certainly trended, I think, to be more of like a light blue state. And one of the reasons for that is Northern Virginia, you know, highly educated, diverse, exactly the kinds of places where Donald Trump just doesn't really have much appeal compared to the John McCain, Mitt Romney, George W. Bush Republican Party. And so I'd kind of thought over time that, you know, North Carolina would be the next Virginia, and then Georgia would be sort of the next North Carolina, that the states sort of realign in that order. And it turns out it's happened differently. Georgia's the state that's realigned. And why is that? Well, it's because of Atlanta. North Carolina does not have a dominant, growing, diverse urban area that makes up the sort of share of the vote that Metro Atlanta does in Georgia. The other thing about North Carolina is that it has some areas that are kind of similar to the red trending parts of the Midwest, kind of post-industrial areas. You also have, there's a little bit of kind of Florida in it, in that you also have some growing conservative retirement areas in the eastern part of the state. Georgia doesn't really have any of that. They don't have the sort of post-industrial areas, the kind of small town areas that are trending Republican, and they don't have the these kind of Republican retirement hubs, which is part of the reason why, again, Florida has sort of moved kind of off the competitive board. And I think Democrats reasonably looked at North Carolina and thought realistically that it just wasn't that good of a target, that ultimately Pennsylvania and Wisconsin were better offensive targets, which they were, because again, they flipped Pennsylvania and came relatively close to flipping Wisconsin.
So I think part of this is just a quick follow-up here, and just, you know, let's think about, again, a lot of your answer was about structure and the lay of the land, which of course dominates a lot of why things happen. I think part of what was implied in the question was the news media didn't pay much attention to it. And does the news media have a role? And do you see evidence of when the news media pays more attention? Like tons of coverage about Georgia, less about North Carolina, tons of coverage about Wisconsin, less about North Carolina. Is that causal in any way, or is it
I mean, I
already
don't
influenced by these things that you're describing in your answer to the first question.
really think so. And I also, when you're talking about coverage, like it's somewhat impressionistic, unless maybe there are statistics about mentions of the race or something. But I remember there being, big profiles about Sherry Beasley and talking about Ted Budd in that state. And of course, there did end up being a lot of spending in that state. So now, do people like me in a small way contribute to like the perception of the election? And therefore, if someone is sort of underrated, does that hurt them? And this sort of also gets to one of this other dynamic in the election we didn't talk about at all, was there ended up being a lot of Republican pollsters who came in sort of particularly near the end and, quote, flooded the zone with Republican leaning polls. And that may have contributed to perceptions that Republicans would do better than they ended up doing. I thought the Republicans would do better than they ended up doing. And I struggle to think, like, does that actually have an impact on voting behavior? Like, it's not like perceptions of Republicans doing better caused the Republicans to do better, because they didn't do better than they didn't do as well as they should have. Like I remember in 2016, like polling overestimated Hillary Clinton. It certainly didn't help Hillary Clinton because she didn't win. And in fact, maybe it helped Donald Trump because, maybe Democrats were overconfident or something, or maybe Republicans were overconfident in this election. It's sometimes if you're following along on social media or whatever, the flooding of the zone by Republican pollsters is sometimes cited as this like deliberate strategy to sort of shape perceptions of the election. But like, to what end? What do you get out of it? I just don't understand, because I don't think it helped. So it's did it happen? Yes. Does it matter? I don't know.
Quick plug for a article published by one of my former PhD students, who's now at VCU, just down the road from you. Mallory Perryman, Jordan Foley, and I did this experiment where we showed people polls in swing states, where this was in 2016, where credibly either Trump or Clinton could have been ahead because there were polls that showed either them ahead.
Yeah.
People interpreted the polls for their candidate losing as biased, and assume that their side to be the one that was more motivated to vote, regardless of whether their candidate was winning or losing, just to kind of get to that perception stuff. And since I mentioned the former president's name there as we thought about that election, two questions I'm going to try to combine here from the audience about the former president. One about, does Trump not being on the ballot hurt Republicans in the Midwest? And then second, who are potential challengers in a Republican primary, maybe DeSantis excluded, since you've already mentioned him.
It certainly seems possible that that's the case in the Midwest. But here's the thing is that, Democrats didn't do well in these states necessarily because of turnout. I mean, I mentioned that, some of the kind of big Democratic vote hubs in the Midwest did not necessarily perform all that great. In fact, the little historical tidbit, Allegheny County, which where Pittsburgh is in Pennsylvania, actually cast substantially more votes than Philadelphia did, which is, I think, has happened in the past, but is sort of unusual. Yeah. And so it goes to show that I don't think Republican turnout was that bad. I think Republican persuasion was bad, in that they had a number of again, and they basically had sort of a non-entity far right candidate as the gubernatorial candidate in Pennsylvania, who ended up losing in a landslide, and I think probably contributed to to John Fetterman being able to win the Senate race, and ended up being not even that close. I think he won by like 4 or 5 points. So maybe I do think there was some sort of discussion that, in terms of polling, that there's a certain kind of voter that was sort of hard for the polls to reach in 2016 and 2020, sort of low trust folks who maybe are likely to lean toward Donald Trump. And so maybe that accounts for some of the disparities in polling. And so maybe some of those folks are, likelier to show up in the presidential year. It may also be the fact that, there has been this trade-off going on in the electorate, and that Democrats have been picking up more and more white voters with a 4-year degree, while shedding white voters who don't have a 4-year degree. Education level is sort of, correlates with higher voting. And so maybe the Democrats picking up more reliable voters has helped them in this midterm kind of environment. So maybe in a presidential year, some of the Trumpier voters, show up, and that it makes these states closer than they were in the midterm. But again, it's sort of hard to know. And again, I wouldn't categorize the turnout in the swing states as being like super Democratic leaning, demographically speaking. Right. It's just the persuasion was I think the problem for Republicans.
Some of the people you're talking about in this answer, we might often think of as suburban voters. A question in the Zoom asked about trends you're seeing in the suburban vote. I know in Wisconsin, whereas Governor Evers performed better overall, he lost a lot of ground in rural areas, but in the WOW counties that surround Milwaukee, Washington, Ozaukee, and as we are I think legally obligated to say critical Waukesha County. These counties, Evers lost all three, but improved his stance relatively substantially. Are you seeing similar sorts of trends in suburbs around the country?
Yeah, I mean, the Milwaukee suburbs have long stood out as like really overwhelmingly Republican compared to other suburban areas. Because if you look at like suburban Philly or some of the suburbs around the Twin Cities in Minnesota, they're much more Democratic leaning than the so-called WOW counties are. But yeah, some of the erosion there contributed to why Scott Walker lost in 2018, why Biden was able to win Wisconsin in 2020, and then also Governor Evers' reelection. One other little just sort of interesting trend we've seen across the Midwest is that some of the kind of like resort places, for lack of a better way of putting it, Door County is a great example, which I've also been to Door County and I had a great time up there a couple of years ago. But Door County is actually, it's not like a perfect bellwether for Wisconsin, but it's sort of had more of a reputation of that. And of course it went for Evers, but it also went for Ron Johnson, right? I think by like 100 votes or something, very narrowly. But you could see like Traverse City in Michigan, I can't remember the name of the county, but sort of the tip of the top of Minnesota. One of the counties there, like the Democrats did really well in those places in 2020. You sort of saw that continue in 2022. But yeah, more broadly about the suburbs, you've seen some Democratic improvement in those places, and it's crucial in the kind of Great Lakes heartland states because again, the rural areas are bad and generally getting worse for Democrats.
Question now that gets back to some of the structural elements of elections. Do you think that the low approval rates for Biden show a weakening link between presidential approval and midterm elections? And I say we could even expand this out to other critically, kind of fundamentals like the state of the economy and those sort of, is there just less of a link between those and midterm election results?
It certainly could be. One thing about like 2018 is that the economic numbers are really pretty good in 2018, although they really, in some ways you could argue they're very good now. Despite the inflation problem, we just got GDP growth the other day. It was 3% in the third quarter, which is, pretty decent. Unemployment just came out today. I'm no economist and I don't pretend to be. And you can cut the unemployment numbers in 100 different ways, but I think labor force participation was down, but the actual unemployment rate and job growth was pretty decent. And so that, these economic factors are sort of hard to sort of explain, but they also may not be as predictive as they used to be because, and I think like Trump's approval in 2018 was really important in a way I think Biden's maybe wasn't in 2022. And I think 18 was sort of more clearly a referendum on Trump than this election was on Biden. It also may be that, approval ratings, they don't move as much as they used to. They've been very consistent. Like if you look at like just like the standard deviation basically of like Obama and Trump and Biden's approval rating, it's like, it's much lower than it used to be when presidential approval used to bounce around a lot more. And so it may just be that, that to sort of a kind of a lower approval rating is maybe more than like what we would expect. And that voters are taking different things into account. One thing that was striking was that if you look at the exit poll, and this was true in the pre-election polling too, is that you could split approval of Biden into four groups, strong approve, weak approve, weak disapprove, and strong disapprove. And Biden in the exit poll actually won weak disapprovers, or Democrats, I mean, won weak disapprovers, which you wouldn't necessarily expect in a midterm. But that goes to those are the voters who are cross-pressured, many of whom are probably independents, who maybe didn't like Biden that much, but they also were scared off by the Republicans for certain reasons. And they ended up breaking more toward the Democrats. And frankly, I think it speaks to an electorate that maybe is a little more sophisticated than we give it credit for, because one of the big trends that you sort of see, and I mentioned this, is sort of nationalization of results, candidate quality maybe not mattering as much, incumbency not mattering as much. But actually, a lot of those things did, I think, end up mattering more in 22. And we're having these sort of bigger electorates, and at least some segment of the voters maybe have a little bit more discerning taste than we give them credit for.
So a couple points in that answer. You mentioned Trump being on the ballot. You mentioned there might be other reasons that might have spun some voters who might have been persuadable away from Republicans in this particular cycle. I think this question from the audience is getting at one of the potential explanations for that. And the question is, inflation and abortion aside, what impact did saving democracy have on the midterm?
Well, you look at some of these like Secretary of State races that hardly get any attention at all. But first of all, Democrats generally had a huge spending advantage in some of these key Secretary of State races, be it in Michigan or in Arizona or in Nevada, where you had basically kind of real far right election denier Republican candidates who ended up doing quite poorly. So that there was probably some sort of campaign effect there too. But I think Democrats were able to successfully paint those folks as extremists, and frankly, they were extremists. That they were sort of hanging on to Donald Trump's complaints about 2020, which are animating for significant number of Republicans, but certainly not all Republicans. Again, it speaks to this broader kind of candidate quality problem. I just think that Republican primary voters made a lot of, frankly, sort of weak choices, and a big question was whether they'd be punished for that, and they were.
So I was at a conference earlier this week. Shannon McGregor, who you'll hear her great research from later, was also there. On the conference panel were the secretaries of state from Georgia and Michigan, one Democrat, one Republican. They were asked, did election denialism take a fatal blow in the elections? Both said no, and said yes, in some of the high profile gubernatorial races, most Senate races, but not all, election deniers didn't win, but more than 100 members of the House who can be broadly categorized as won fairly easily. And so as you look to the next set of elections, how big of a role do you see that issue continuing to play, both in terms of how it influences people's potential decision to participate in their vote choice, but also just in terms of the overall health and maintenance of a democracy?
Well, look, we know that if Trump is the nominee, he's going to be just saying irresponsible things about this all the time. And in fact, he claimed he won the popular vote in 2016 because, California is not supposed to count or something like that. So he's just a highly irresponsible actor when talking about these sorts of things. And so I guess the more interesting question is, if he's not the nominee, how will other Republicans talk about it? Because I think there is, some of it is starting, or I think has long sounded like, but maybe is starting to sound to swing voters like essentially kind of crybaby stuff that like, oh, well, the Democrats they're doing, absentee voting and this and that. Like, it's called organizing. It's called like running an election based on the rules that you have. And certainly there are debates about what the rules should be and how easy or difficult should it be to vote absentee and whatnot. But ultimately, you've got to run the election based on the rules that you have. Like, great example here. So Georgia, we've got this runoff going on, and there was this legal battle about whether there was going to be early voting over this past weekend. And eventually it was decided that there could be. And so a lot of the Democratic counties decided to offer it. And a lot of the Republican counties decided not to. And so that allowed Democrats to sort of get a head start. And part of the kind of basic blocking and tackling of elections is like, having fights about the rules, but then once the fight is resolved, trying to play the game as best you can. And I think Republicans in some ways have sort of almost disenfranchised their own voters, or made their voters, more suspicious about things based on these totally unfounded complaints about the past election. And so, look, obviously there are lots of Republicans in safe House seats who voted, did not vote to accept the, the election results in 2020. But, a lot of them are in districts where it's impossible for a Republican to lose. And so these folks are going to be around. But, it does seem like that if that's sort of the focus for Republicans in the 2024 campaign, there are enough voters in the key states who don't really seem to like that much, that it could put them at a disadvantage, in the election.
One that you mentioned in there early in that answer about the importance of organizing. One question from the Zoom audience is, in which states do the major parties need to improve grassroots efforts for 2024?
Well, Florida Democratic Party is like basically dead. And it's always been at the organizational disadvantage against the Florida Republicans. But, some of the key trends in that state are also moving Republican. And like, if you just look at the turnout disparity, basically just a lot of registered Republicans voted and registered Democrats didn't. The same thing was true in New York. Part of the reason why the Democrats lost so many House seats up there and the gubernatorial race was pretty close is that the Democratic organization up there just didn't do a good job. Kathy Hochul, I think, did not run that great of a campaign, and Republicans were just more interested. You think about some of the states where I think you've got sort of strong party organizations on one side. The Ohio Republican Party, for instance, I think has always been just a much more well-oiled machine than the Ohio Democratic Party has been. And I think that contributes in maybe small ways to how Ohio has changed. I think that these big demographic factors we're talking about are probably more important. It seems like Democrats have a fairly robust state party here in Wisconsin, despite some of the despite some of the demographic challenges in the state. And the old Harry Reid machine in Nevada still seems to be working quite well. They did lose the governorship, but under, I think, extremely trying circumstances, were able to reelect very narrowly Catherine Cortez Masto. And again, when races are decided by 6, 8, 10 points, you don't necessarily think of sort of the party organization as being super important in the outcome. Now, maybe that sort of those disparities help kind of lead to some blowouts. Like I think that maybe is what happened in Florida. But when you're talking about 1 or 2 point races, I think some of those organizational advantages can come into play. And, again, there are some places where one party seems to have sort of a longer standing advantage. I'd say, Democrats in Nevada, Republicans in Florida to the extent that it's close. And there are a few other places where you might make that kind of observation.
In those 1 to 2% races, there are mid-level single-digit percentage of voters engaged in split ticket voting. And one of the audience questions asked about your thoughts on the future of split ticket voting and what sorts of things might drive that.
So we actually just had something to Crystal Ball on Wednesday about that. There were, again, assuming Warnock wins in Georgia, not guaranteed or anything, there would be 6 states that voted differently for Senate and for governor. Now, some of them had gigantic disparities. In Vermont, for instance, Phil Scott, the moderate Republican there, won by 47 points in a state that, votes overwhelmingly Democratic for president. And the Democrats won the Senate seat by 40 points. So there was an 87-point gap between the gubernatorial and the Senate race. Now, New England's a little bit different, a lot of more ticket splitting up there. And functionally, Phil Scott is not really a Republican in the way that you think of a national Republican as being. New Hampshire, there was I think maybe a 25 point gap between the Senate gubernatorial race. And of course, here in Wisconsin, you did have a difference, but a pretty small difference. Same thing with Nevada, same thing with Georgia, at least in the first round of results. So we think of ticket splitting as being on the decline. And of course, if you go back a few decades and we did this to Crystal Ball in another article, you could find years where there's 10, 12, 14 states where you have, a different outcome for Senate and governor. Doesn't happen quite as much as it used to, but it does still happen. And, the same thing is true for the House elections, that you do have, presidential partisanship is not perfectly predictive of everything, although it is predictive of a lot.
Couple questions now about the presentation itself and some follow-ups, one of which is, what explains Republican gains in the 2022 House vote in New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island when they lost ground in all the surrounding states?
One of the things I think was candidate quality, particularly in Rhode Island. Rhode Island has 2 House seats. That's another race that was an open seat race. There was a longtime Democratic incumbent, Jim Langevin, who retired in Rhode Island. Republicans had pretty strong candidate there, a guy named Alan Fung, who'd run for governor a few times, a former mayor. It kind of looked like Fung actually was in decent shape to win. He ended up losing, but that ended up being a race that Democrats had to put a lot of money into. And that also helps explain why the overall House vote in Rhode Island was more competitive. Same thing was true in Connecticut 5, where Republicans almost won. They had a good candidate in that race as well. And in New York State, again, in a lot of places, particularly Long Island, like Nassau County, Republicans, obviously registered way more registered Democrats and registered Republicans in New York, but registered Republicans voted at like presidential level turnout rates and Democrats did not. And that contributed to Republicans winning a number of House seats across the state, including winning New York 4, which I mentioned. I mentioned the sort of the breakdown of House seats based on how Biden did in them, and that there's a sort of band of competitive races. I said there was one Republican who won a race where Biden got better than 55% of the vote, and it was Anthony D'Esposito in New York 4, because I think part of it was the Democratic turnout collapse, but also it was, probably had to do with candidate quality and persuasion. But one overall trend in the House that continued this year is, and we've seen this happen in a number of elections over the past 20 years, is that Republicans continued to get totally shut out of New England. They don't hold any of the House seats in that 6-state region. Granted, it's pretty small. They do still have Susan Collins in the Senate, but
they lost Chris Shays, I remember, 15 years ago.
He was,
and that was
it was it's happened in 2008. And it also happened in 18, 20, and now 22.
A broader question just about the kind of and this is indicative of Barry's comments too, I think at the beginning of, all this money, all this time, all this rancor, the result is surprising and kind of holds. Is the more dominant explanation turnout or persuasion?
We're going to get probably better data in the coming months from like voter file and stuff about, who showed up, who didn't, et cetera. This was a big discussion in Virginia because, of course, in 2021, Glenn Youngkin ended up doing 12 points better than Donald Trump did on margin in Virginia. And, when that happens, it's a combination of both. If you look at the, where the places where sort of the raw vote increased the most from the past gubernatorial election, 2017, a lot of them were like super blood red areas, rural and ex-urban counties. And so I think it's fair to say that there was a Republican turnout advantage in Virginia. However, there's also evidence that suggests that there was a persuasion advantage for Republicans too. You need both to make up such a huge gap. My thinking is that it does seem like when you look at the whole country that, certainly it was a more Republican leaning turnout mix than we saw in 2018, which was a more Democratic leaning year. And that, in certain places, Republicans did do okay or well enough on persuasion. And also the fact that you did have some differences between the Senate gubernatorial results, like turnout doesn't explain necessarily why Ron Johnson and Tony Evers both won, because there were people who voted for both of them. Not a lot of them, but enough to sort of make the difference. Again, maybe if turnout had been a little bit better, maybe Barnes had gotten over the finish line too. But it's always kind of a mix. So I know that's kind of a ducking the question, but again, you do look at people who showed up who said they at least somewhat disapproved of Joe Biden. Also, people who describe themselves as independents. People who describe themselves as moderates. Democrats won all of those groups, not by a lot, but they did, based on the exit poll, they did win those groups.
I always tell my students, be very wary of anybody who says this is the reason the election went the way that it did. There are many reasons. We've talked about, you went through many of them in your presentation. We've gone through lots of them in the Q&A. We have time for 2 more quick questions. One from the Zoom audience. That's a follow-up on what you had mentioned about Black voter turnout. And the question is just, how do we understand the low turnout of Black voters? Is it voter depression? Is it cynicism? Is it fatalism? Failure to be targeted by candidates? What?
It does seem like since Obama, there's been a little bit of a drop off in the Black vote. And, you did have, you did have some pretty strong, Black candidates who were running in some of these states. We mentioned, I think Val Demings is a pretty good candidate in Florida, even though she ended up getting wiped out by Marco Rubio. Sherry Beasley in North Carolina. Again, reasonable people may disagree on Mandela Barnes, but you did have a prominent Black candidate running for Senate in here in Wisconsin. And, and there has been a little bit of erosion in Democratic support amongst Black voters, although maybe that just has to do with maybe some Black voters are falling off. There are some indications too that particularly younger Black men are maybe not quite as Democratic. One interesting little demographic quirk is that, we talk so much about, it hasn't come up today, but I'll bring it up now, religiosity amongst white voters, basically that church attendance or non-church attendance is sort of predictive of whether you're maybe more Republican leaning if you go to church more often, or more Democratic leaning if you don't. Certainly white evangelical Christians are a much more Republican leaning bloc than the broader white electorate as a whole. But amongst Black voters, greater church attendance is actually predictive of being even more Democratic, and not, non-church attendance is, that group, again, Black voters as a whole are still overwhelmingly Democratic. But that the church is such an important, historically, such an important social kind of organizing institution for Black voters, and that attachment to the church might be a little bit higher amongst older folks than younger Black voters, and that there might be a little bit of erosion amongst that sort of younger group. And it's sort of maybe something to watch over time. There's been a lot written about this. I would not consider myself an expert on that particular piece of it, but it is just something interesting demographically to watch. And you do see, just broadly speaking, that there has been some Democratic erosion with non-white voters in general. It seems like Latino turnout was not particularly good, although there also were some signs that Democrats were going to face this real reckoning with Latino voters, and it did not happen. And some places we were looking for it were Nevada and South Texas. You did see it in South Florida, but that happened in 2020 as well. But Democrats kind of held the line there. And so Republicans did not necessarily have the breakthrough that they were that they were looking for.
Great. There's a terrific book, Steadfast Democrats, by Ismail White and Cheryl Laird, about Black voters in the Democratic Party. That also can help folks think through some of those great questions. I'll also plug, we talked about split ticket voting. Barry's co-authored book, Why Americans Split Their Tickets. And in terms of the religiosity, there's a great book called The Political Influence of Churches by Paul Jupe and somebody Gilbert, whose name I'm blanking on. Now I regret that this is being recorded. Sorry to Gilbert. Last question for you, as we are at time, and luckily it's one that it requires no analysis. Since you've been in Madison, has anyone mistaken you to be our volleyball coach, Kelly Sheffield?
I have to, although the team's pretty good, aren't they?
They're very good.
Yeah.
Defending national champions.
Oh, well, there you go.
Big
So,
Ten champions.
well, I guess we'll find out.